In the early years of the war, German armored forces didn't just win battles, they rewrote the rules of fear. Across Europe, the sound of tracks grinding over roads and fields became a warning that something unstoppable was coming. Soldiers whispered about it long before they ever saw it. The German Panzer force had built a reputation not just on steel and firepower, but on momentum, fast, coordinated, and devastating. When the first reports of heavy German tanks reached Allied lines, they sounded almost exaggerated. Machines weighing over 50 tons, with armor so thick that standard anti-tank guns struggled to penetrate it, and guns powerful enough to destroy enemy tanks at distances where return fire was nearly impossible. The Panzerkampfwagen 6th Tiger I, better known simply as the Tiger, quickly became the symbol of that fear. Its 88mm gun, originally derived from anti-aircraft weapons, could punch through armor with terrifying efficiency. Not long after, the Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther entered the battlefield, combining sloped armor and high-velocity firepower in a way that shocked Allied tank crews. To the men facing them, these machines didn't feel like vehicles, they felt like moving fortresses. But the legend of German tank superiority didn't begin with the Tiger or Panther. It was built earlier, during lightning-fast campaigns that seemed almost impossible to stop. In Poland, in France, and in the early stages of the Soviet invasion, German armored units advanced with a speed and coordination the world had never seen before. Radios in every tank allowed commanders to adapt instantly, to exploit weakness, to strike where the enemy least expected. Entire armies collapsed not because they were destroyed, but because they were outmaneuvered and outpaced. This was the birth of what many would later call blitzkrieg, a form of warfare that relied on shock, speed, and relentless pressure. And at the center of it all were the Panzers. By the time Allied forces began to push back in places like North Africa and Italy, the psychological impact of German armor had already taken root. Tank crews were trained to expect that if they encountered a Tiger or Panther head-on, their chances of survival dropped dramatically. Reports spread quickly, some accurate, others exaggerated, of shells bouncing harmlessly off thick German armor, of entire units being wiped out before they could even get within effective range. Fear became a force multiplier. In many ways, the battlefield turned into a contest of machines. Soldiers, commanders, even war correspondents began to frame the conflict as a duel between tanks. Which gun was bigger? Which armor was thicker? Which vehicle could survive longer under fire? The narrative was simple, almost cinematic: steel versus steel, one-on-one, winner takes all. And in that narrative, German tanks seemed unbeatable. But this way of thinking came with a dangerous assumption that wars are decided by the strongest individual weapon, that if one side builds a more powerful tank, it will dominate the battlefield. It's an idea that feels intuitive, almost logical. Bigger gun, thicker armor, better protection, it should win. Yet war has never been that simple. Behind the scenes, far from the spotlight of tank duels, another system of warfare was quietly taking shape, one that didn't rely on a single vehicle or a single moment of confrontation, one that didn't care how thick your armor was or how powerful your gun might be, because it wasn't designed to fight tanks, it was designed to erase them. Still, at this point in the war, few understood that. For the average soldier on the ground, the threat was immediate and visible. A German tank cresting a hill, the silhouette of a Tiger in the distance, the sound of its engine growing louder. These were the moments that defined survival. And so the myth continued to grow. German generals, confident in their armored divisions, believed their technological edge would carry them through the war. They invested heavily in producing more advanced tanks, pushing for heavier armor and more powerful weapons. Each new model was seen as proof that they were still ahead, still superior. But there was a hidden flaw in that thinking. Because while Germany focused on building better tanks, the United States and its allies were asking a different question entirely. Not how to build a better tank, but how to destroy one without ever engaging it directly. It's a subtle difference, but it would change everything.
The battlefield of World War II was not just a test of machines, it was a test of systems, of coordination, communication, and strategy, and the belief that armor alone could guarantee victory would soon collide with a reality far more complex and far more deadly. The Invincible Panzer wasn't just a weapon, it was an idea, and like all ideas, it could be broken.
By the time American forces fully entered the European battlefield, they were already studying a different kind of war. Not one defined by individual weapons, but by coordination, timing, and overwhelming firepower delivered with precision. While German doctrine placed its pride in armored breakthroughs, the United States Army had quietly built its entire battlefield philosophy around something far less visible, yet infinitely more destructive: artillery. To American commanders, artillery was not just support, it was the main weapon. Infantry held ground, tanks exploited breakthroughs, but artillery decided whether the enemy could fight at all. This belief wasn't new. It had roots in the brutal lessons of World War I, where massed artillery had already proven capable of reshaping entire battlefields. But what the U.S. Army did in the 1940s was take that raw destructive power and turn it into a highly organized, almost scientific system. At the heart of that system was something the Germans never fully replicated: the Fire Direction Center, or FDC. Instead of each artillery battery operating independently, calculating its own firing solutions, the Americans centralized everything. When a target was identified, the information didn't stay at the gun line. It was sent back to the FDC, where trained specialists, often working with maps, plotting boards, and early analog computing methods, calculated exactly how every gun in range could contribute to the strike. Distance, elevation, weather conditions, shell type, fuse timing, all of it was processed in seconds. Then, in a single coordinated command, multiple batteries, sometimes dozens of guns spread across miles, would fire as one. To an outside observer, it might not have seemed revolutionary. Artillery had always been part of warfare. But what made this system different was speed and synchronization. American units could receive a call for fire and respond in minutes, sometimes even faster. And because everything was centrally controlled, they could mass firepower on a single point with incredible efficiency. A German unit might believe it was facing a few guns. In reality, it could be targeted by an entire network. This system also meant flexibility. Guns didn't belong to just one unit in a rigid sense. If a division needed more firepower, additional batteries could be assigned almost instantly. Fire could be shifted, concentrated, or redirected based on the changing conditions of the battlefield. It turned artillery into something dynamic, almost alive. And then there was the human element. The American artillery system relied on coordination between observers, communication teams, and firing units. Every part had to work together seamlessly. Radios became as important as rifles. A single clear transmission could trigger the movement of thousands of pounds of steel through the air. This was something German forces struggled to counter. Their doctrine emphasized initiative at the local level, which worked well for fast-moving armored warfare, but it didn't translate as effectively into large-scale centralized fire coordination. Their artillery was powerful, but it often lacked the same level of integration and responsiveness. The difference wasn't just technical, it was philosophical. Where German commanders often thought in terms of direct engagement, the Americans were thinking in terms of control over space. If an area could be targeted by artillery at any moment, it effectively belonged to them, regardless of who physically occupied it. This idea changed how battles were fought. Positions that looked safe on a map could become death traps in seconds. Roads, fields, forests, any location that was observed could be turned into a killing zone. Movement became dangerous. Concentration of forces became risky. Even armored units, designed to withstand direct fire, were not immune to what was coming from above. And yet, at this stage, many German units still didn't fully grasp what they were facing. They had encountered artillery before, they understood its power, but they were used to a different rhythm, barrages that built up, that could be anticipated, that gave some warning before the storm hit. But what they were about to face was something entirely else. Because the American system wasn't just about firing more shells, it was about delivering them in a way that maximized shock, confusion, and destruction all at once. No gradual escalation, no clear signal, just sudden, overwhelming force. It was a method designed not just to destroy, but to paralyze, to break units before they could react. And as this system spread across the European theater, supported by an industrial base capable of producing vast quantities of ammunition, it began to tip the balance in ways that were not immediately visible, but impossible to ignore. The myth of the invincible tank had been built on the idea of direct confrontation, but the American artillery doctrine was quietly removing that confrontation altogether, because you can't outgun what you can't see, and you can't fight back against something that has already calculated exactly where you stand.
For generations, artillery followed a familiar rhythm. A few ranging shots would fall first, adjustments, corrections, warnings. Soldiers learned to read those signs. The first shells were often inaccurate, but they told you something important. You were being targeted. If you moved fast enough, you might survive what came next. That expectation became instinct. But the Americans were about to remove that instinct entirely. They developed a method that didn't begin with warning shots, didn't give time to react, and didn't follow the predictable patterns soldiers had come to rely on. It was called time on target, TOT. And when it worked, the first shell you heard was the one that killed you. The concept itself was deceptively simple. Instead of firing all guns at once, artillery units spread across different locations would fire at carefully calculated times, adjusting for distance, trajectory, and shell travel time. Some shells would be in the air longer, some shorter, but all of them, regardless of where they were fired from, would arrive at the exact same moment. Not seconds apart, not in waves, at once. To make this happen required an extraordinary level of precision. Crews had to calculate firing data down to the smallest variables: angle, charge, elevation, even environmental factors like wind and air density. Communication had to be flawless. Timing had to be exact. There was no room for error. But when it came together, the effect was devastating. A German unit could be resting, regrouping, or preparing for movement, completely unaware it had been identified. There would be no distant rumble building in the background, no scattered impacts to signal danger, just a sudden, violent eruption as dozens, sometimes hundreds of shells detonated simultaneously across their position. Men didn't have time to run. Officers didn't have time to give orders. Vehicles didn't have time to move. In a single instant, the entire area would be consumed by explosions. Survivors often described it not as a barrage, but as a single, overwhelming udar, a moment where the ground itself seemed to explode in every direction at once. The psychological effect was just as powerful as the physical destruction. Units that weren't completely destroyed were often left disoriented, unable to understand what had just happened or where the fire had come from. And that confusion was part of the design. Traditional artillery gave the enemy a chance to adapt. TOT denied that completely. It turned artillery into an ambush weapon, something closer to a trap than a bombardment. By the time you realized you were under attack, it was already over. For German forces, this was deeply unsettling. Their training and experience had prepared them for many forms of combat, but not this. They were used to reacting quickly, to counterattacking, to regaining initiative. But how do you counter something that strikes without warning and disappears just as fast? You can't. Even heavily armored units, including those equipped with formidable machines like the Panzer VI Tiger I, found themselves vulnerable in ways they hadn't anticipated. Thick armor could protect against direct fire, but it offered little against coordinated explosions saturating an entire area. Tracks could be damaged, optics shattered, crews concussed. A tank didn't have to be destroyed to be rendered useless, it just had to be immobilized or its crew incapacitated. And once a unit was caught in a TOT strike, follow-up fire could come quickly, adjusting based on the results observed. What began as a single perfectly timed udar could evolve into sustained destruction if necessary. But often it didn't need to, because the true power of time on target wasn't just in the shells it delivered, it was in the fear it created afterward. Once soldiers experienced it, they knew it could happen again at any moment. Any position could be targeted, any pause could be fatal. The battlefield no longer felt predictable, safety became an illusion, and that constant uncertainty began to erode confidence. German commanders who once relied on speed and aggressive maneuver now had to consider the risk of sudden annihilation every time they concentrated forces. Gathering units for an attack became dangerous. Holding a position for too long became risky. Even moving in daylight could attract attention that led to instant destruction. It forced hesitation, it slowed momentum, and in a war where timing and initiative were everything, even small delays could have massive consequences. Time on target didn't just change how artillery was used, it changed how the enemy thought. It turned the battlefield into a place where death could arrive without warning, from distances you couldn't see, in a form you couldn't stop. No duel, no engagement, no chance to fight back. Just a single, perfectly calculated moment. And by the time that moment arrived, it was already too late.
By now, the battlefield had already begun to change. Artillery could strike without warning. Entire units could disappear in seconds, and the illusion of safety was fading fast. But there was still one question that mattered more than anything else. How do you find the target? Because even the most powerful artillery system is useless if it doesn't know where to fire. The answer came in the form of individuals who rarely appeared in headlines, rarely received recognition, but held an almost terrifying level of power in their hands. They were called forward observers, and in many ways, they were the most dangerous men on the battlefield. A forward observer didn't carry heavy weapons. He didn't command large units. By now, the battlefield had already begun to change. Artillery could strike without warning. Entire units could disappear in seconds, and the illusion of safety was fading fast. But there was still one question that mattered more than anything else. How do you find the target? Because even the most powerful artillery system is useless if it doesn't know where to fire. The answer came in the form of individuals who rarely appeared in headlines, rarely received recognition, but held an almost terrifying level of power in their hands. They were called forward observers, and in many ways, they were the most dangerous men on the battlefield. A forward observer didn't carry heavy weapons. He didn't command large units. Often, he was just a young officer or even an enlisted soldier with a radio, a map, and a pair of binoculars. But that radio connected him directly to the full weight of American artillery. With a few calm, precise words, he could bring down destruction on anything he could see. His job was simple in theory: locate the enemy, identify targets, and call in fire. But in practice, it required nerves of steel. Forward observers operated close to the front lines, often exposed, often under fire, and always aware that if they were spotted, they would become a priority target, because the enemy understood exactly what they represented. A single observer could direct multiple artillery batteries. He could adjust fire in real time, walking shells onto a target with increasing accuracy. The first round might land slightly off. The second would be closer,
and the third, if needed, would be right on top of the target. But as the system improved, even that adjustment phase began to disappear. Observers became faster, more accurate, more confident. In many cases, the first rounds were already close enough to be deadly, and once the fire mission was confirmed, the full weight of coordinated artillery could be unleashed within minutes. To the soldiers on the receiving end, it felt almost supernatural. One moment, everything was quiet. The next, the sky was falling. And the most unsettling part was that they often had no idea where it was coming from. There were no visible guns, no clear front line of attack, just an unseen observer somewhere in the distance, watching, calculating, speaking into a radio. Then came the aircraft. High above the battlefield, small, slow-moving planes began to appear, so light and fragile-looking that they seemed completely out of place in a war dominated by heavy machinery. These were observation aircraft, often simple designs like the Piper L-4 Grasshopper, derived from civilian planes. They had no heavy armor, no powerful weapons. In many cases, they weren't even armed at all. And yet, they became one of the most feared sights for German troops. From the ground, they looked almost harmless, a fabric-covered aircraft flying low and slow, sometimes barely faster than a car. German soldiers even gave them nicknames, mocking their appearance. But the moment one appeared overhead, everything changed, because that aircraft wasn't there to fight, it was there to observe. From the air, visibility was unmatched. Roads, supply lines, troop movements, hidden positions, everything became easier to spot. And once something was seen, it could be reported instantly to artillery units waiting miles away. The aircraft didn't need to attack, it only needed to point. And once it did, the response could be immediate and overwhelming. German units quickly learned that being seen was often more dangerous than being engaged. Camouflage became critical. Movement had to be timed carefully. Even then, it wasn't always enough. The sky itself had become an extension of the artillery network. There was nowhere to hide. Attempts to shoot these planes down were often frustrating. Their low speed and maneuverability made them surprisingly difficult targets. Anti-aircraft guns struggled to track them effectively, and fighters were often too fast to engage easily. Meanwhile, the damage they enabled continued to grow. It created a constant sense of exposure. At any moment, you could be watched. At any moment, your position could be marked. And at any moment, without warning, artillery could arrive. This combination, forward observers on the ground and observation aircraft in the air, turned the American artillery system into something far more than just a weapon. It became a network, a system of eyes and guns working together, feeding information, reacting instantly, striking with precision. And it was relentless. There was no need for direct confrontation, no need for visible dominance. Control came from awareness, from communication, from the ability to act faster than the enemy could respond. For German forces, this was deeply unsettling. They were no longer just fighting soldiers or machines. They were fighting a system that could see them, track them, and destroy them without ever exposing itself. The battlefield had become transparent. And once you could be seen, you could be destroyed.
By the final stages of the war, something had fundamentally changed on the battlefield. The German belief in armored superiority, the idea that a powerful tank could dominate any fight, was beginning to collapse, not because their tanks had suddenly become weak, but because they were facing a form of warfare that ignored their strengths entirely. Armor was designed to stop direct hits. But what happens when the attack doesn't come directly at all? American artillery had already proven it could strike fast, strike precisely, and strike without warning, but now it introduced something even more devastating, an innovation that turned every shell into a far more lethal weapon, especially against exposed troops and lightly protected crews. It was known as the proximity fuse. Unlike traditional shells that exploded on impact or after a timed delay, this new fuse used a tiny radar device inside the projectile. As the shell descended toward the ground, it continuously measured its distance from nearby objects. The moment it detected that it was close enough, just a few meters above the surface, it detonated in mid-air. The result was catastrophic. Instead of burying its energy into the ground or exploding against a single point, the shell burst above its target, spraying high-velocity fragments outward and downward over a wide area. Anyone caught below it had almost no protection. Trenches became less effective, cover became unreliable, even being prone on the ground didn't guarantee survival. And when these airbursts were combined with coordinated artillery fire, the effect multiplied. Entire formations could be shredded in seconds. German infantry units, already struggling against the speed and coordination of American artillery, found themselves facing something they couldn't adapt to. The moment shells began exploding above them, their instincts, take cover, lie flat, dig in, stopped working the way they were supposed to. There was no safe position. And then there were the tanks. Machines like the Panzerkampfwagen V Panther and the Panzerkampfwagen VI Tiger I were still formidable in direct combat. Their armor could deflect shells, their guns could destroy enemy vehicles at long range. In a traditional engagement, they remained dangerous opponents. But under artillery fire, their advantages began to fade. A tank didn't need to be penetrated to be neutralized. Repeated blasts around it could damage its tracks, jam its turret, or destroy its external equipment. Visibility could be reduced to almost nothing as dirt, smoke, and debris filled the air. Communication could break down. Crews inside, shaken by constant concussive impacts, could become disoriented or even incapacitated. And once a tank was immobilized, it became a target, not just for more artillery, but for infantry, anti-tank weapons, or air attack. What made this even more devastating was the scale. American artillery wasn't limited to a few guns firing occasionally. It was an entire network capable of delivering sustained, overwhelming firepower across large areas. If a concentration of German armor was detected, it could be targeted, fixed in place, and systematically destroyed, not in a dramatic duel, but through relentless bombardment. There was no moment of heroic last stand, just attrition, pressure, collapse. The psychological impact was just as important as the physical damage. German crews who once trusted in their armor began to realize that they were no longer in control of the fight. They couldn't see the enemy, they couldn't reach the guns firing at them, and they couldn't predict when the next strike would come. Confidence turned into caution. Caution turned into hesitation, and hesitation in war is often fatal. The myth of the invincible Panzer had been built on visibility, on the image of a powerful machine advancing across the battlefield, dominating everything in its path. But artillery erased that image. It turned the battlefield into something chaotic, unpredictable, and deadly in ways that couldn't be countered by thicker armor or bigger guns. Because this wasn't a contest of machines anymore. It was a contest of systems. The United States had built a system that combined observation, communication, coordination, and firepower into a single, seamless process. It didn't rely on one weapon, it relied on all of them working together. And once that system locked onto a target, the outcome was rarely in doubt. German armored forces didn't disappear overnight. They continued to fight, continued to inflict losses, continued to show moments of tactical brilliance. But the strategic reality had shifted. They were no longer the dominant force they once believed themselves to be. In the end, the Panzer didn't die in a dramatic clash of titans. It didn't fall because another tank was stronger or faster. It fell because it was no longer relevant to the kind of war being fought. A war where the deadliest weapon wasn't the one you could see, but the one that had already calculated exactly where you were and decided you wouldn't be there much longer.